So just to have, even if it's just a short recording, I want to talk to you about some leather that Alex asked about. So this is a piece, this is lamb, or no, actually, I think this is calf. When you go to United Leather or go shopping for leather or just go online, United is a wonderful website, or in person, they can really help you tremendously about leather. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about it. So this is a piece of calf, and I can kind of tell that because it's a little bit thicker and has a little bit more structure than this, which almost looks similar. But this is very much thinner and softer. So when you think of the thinner part, this is, say, the easiest one, by the way, to work with on the sewing machine, because it's thin enough to go through the sewing machine easily without having to get a special or go to school and use a special machine. But what's the deal with this nice soft and what we sometimes call glove leather, because it's the kind of leather that you would make gloves out of because it's so thin and so flexible. But you want a jacket out of this, but it's too thin. Yes, you would line your jacket, but I want to have this beefed up just a little bit. You can use interfacing. The first thing I do, though, is I check my leather. Most of the time I already know how it's going to behave. So, but you would check your leather, and I want to iron it. Say, for example, I want to get those wrinkles out. I can iron it, but I can't put the iron flat on there. So I'm going to take what we call a press cloth, and a press cloth is nothing more than another piece of cotton, usually cotton, that's thin. Usually use a solid light color so you're not transferring dye, just in case. And you just lay the cloth over your leather, make sure the leather is flat underneath, and now you can press it. I've got a crease down there. We'll see how this comes out. And it's surprising that the leather can take a little bit of torture. Ouch. So the leather is now not so, there's still a little bit of creases, but you can just check it and redo it. So what will happen sometimes is, and I've only had it happen a couple of times, where the leather totally discolored. It totally looked like I left it out in the rain, and it actually it was a beige, it was like a brown leather, and it came out really rustic looking and really awesome, and I loved it. But if I wanted to make a whole jacket out of it, and I wore that out, it would have destroyed it. So that was just a very unique one time only, and I've been working with leather for a couple of decades. So that was just the one thing to show you that you could press leather if you want. But say you wanted this little piece or this leather to be a little bit thicker, because you want your jacket to have a little bit more structure. We talked about interfacing, and I'll go over that again. Interfacing is usually white or a dark color. You don't usually find it like in reds or greens or anything. It's usually white, gray, or black. And one side of the interfacing is very smooth. The other side is scratchy. That's glue. So this interfacing happens to be a very lightweight, sort of a meshy sort of weave. Some interfacings are not woven at all. They're just poured. So they're a little bit stiffer. Or you can get interfacing that is an actual thin piece of cloth that also has. So basically what I'm saying is interfacing is as varied as fabric. You can buy thick interfacing or very thin. This is very thin, so it's not going to add much to my leather, which is really what I want. I want to add some body and some structure to my leather. I don't want to add, I don't want to lose the supple value of the leather. So the one thing though about the interfacing is what you would do is you would cut out your pieces. Say, for example, you cut out your sleeves, then you would cut out your interfacing. You don't just interface your whole piece of leather or any fabric. You interface your pieces. So that's just a general rule. You don't buy fabric and interface the whole darn thing. It doesn't work out that way for some reason. The fusing isn't as accurate. If you were doing manufacturing, you would actually have your fusing done professionally, and they would fuse a whole roll for you at a time. Just so you know, you could do that. You can do anything in LA. You can buy industrial sewing machines. You can get your leather fused or your fabric. So I'm cutting all this away because I don't want my fusing to stick to my ironing board. So I'm getting away all that part. So I've got the interfacing lined up with the leather. And it can, if it's off a little bit, that's fine. What I do is, since I have the holes in that leather, I'm going to protect my ironing board by putting a little piece of fabric underneath. And again, you would take your press cloth, make sure this is the smooth side and that underneath is a scratchy side so that you're not fusing your press cloth. And again, just hit it with the iron. I usually use a dry iron when I'm using leather. Otherwise, I use steam just about all the time. It doesn't take long for it to fuse. It's very quick. You want to let it cool a little bit. Don't worry if it sticks. Sometimes it sort of sticks a little bit and you peel it off and you feel like you're tearing skin, but it won't hurt it. So now that has beautifully fused to my leather, really smooth. And it has made it, it's still soft and supple, but it has given it the strength to hold up a jacket. It also is going to give it just the right amount of body. If you made a jacket out of leather, that's the glove leather, that's way soft, it's going to look cheap and it's going to look baggy. It's not going to have the generous, or not that, that's not the word. It's not going to have that luxurious look of leather. It's just going to be baggy and it's going to look like cheap leather. So you may, even though you're not wanting to add a lot of structure to your leather, you may want to use just a super fine interfacing just to give the leather that next step of quality that it would really want to have. And you almost won't know that until you are there holding the leather in your hand. So just keep that in mind. It may not be just a universal rule. Once you get your leather, you're going to make some decisions after the fact. It is still very sewable. I love sewing leather. The only thing about sewing leather is that you really can't mess it up, because you will have dots if you have to take it out. But it pretty much sews just like regular fabric. You would use, seam allowances of 1/2 inch. But I like the way leather sews. You can make all kinds of seam allowances on leather. You don't have to use just straight seams. You could use you wouldn't use a flat felled seam like I showed you, but you could use a mock flat felled seam, which is a look. So I'll do that for you really quick. So I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I make that little zipper pouch out of leather all the time. I love it. It's a fun one to have in leather. Just sewing a straight seam allowance. So Alex, if you're going to sew leather, or any of you that are going to sew leather, what you might want to do now is go ahead and get this foot. It's called a Teflon foot, and I happen to have one on my machine. It's white. The foot you guys have on your machine that looks like this, it is probably silver or metal. That is going to drag on leather and vinyl, and like that clear vinyl. The metal is just going to just stick to it, and it drags, and you won't be able to sew with it. It makes a horrible job, and it pushes everything into a pucker. So there's a seam with leather. Actually, I would probably on leather make a note, if you're going to use leather, you would go up a little bit higher. So on your machine, it's like 2.5. I would go up to 3. So you want your stitches a little further apart on leather. That's definitely something you need to do. 3, maybe 3.5, because when they're too close together like that, it doesn't, I don't know, it just looks better. It's not really gonna perforate it. Some people think you would perforate it and it would just punch apart like paper, but it probably won't do that. Now here's what you would do if you wanted to have you don't want to make a flat felled seam, but you want it to look like one. This is called mock flat felled. So what I've done is I folded my fabric over underneath, and I just sew, and I'm watching the edge of the foot so I get a nice straight line. Oops. See, this is these domestic machines. Okay, here we go. So it still has a decent look. If I had red thread, it would look even better. But you got to be a straight sewer. That one's not so straight. But what that did was it folded that inside seam down. You don't have to do that. The inside leather seams, again, once you start playing with your leather, you may address that. Maybe the seams will just be fine. One other thing that I will mention about leather, I'll just do it really quick. Say this is a seam. And say you're making a jacket and you don't really like the way the seam comes out. See how it's just, it's got this bump and it's not rolling and it's not laying flat. You can't always iron leather each time. If the opportunity is that you cannot iron the leather, because it's not really gonna, like when you flatten, you want to flatten this seam. I'm gonna get my hammer. I keep my hammer in my sewing room. This is my hammer. It came out of no one's garage. I bought it for this. So there's a lot of reasons to have a hammer in the sewing room. So especially I have this leather bag that I can't iron the seams on. There's no way it's going to work anyway. So what I do, because leather is pretty malleable, I take that seam and I just hit it with a hammer. You can do it from the outside, but from the inside, but it's easier on the outside. You just hit it and it's loud. I'm just gonna do half so you can see the difference. See how this is laying a little flatter? It's not a big, huge difference, but this is still bumpy. And so it has this hilly look. You want it to lay completely flat. You just lay it and hammer it. Just get your fingers way out of the way. And this works better on thicker leather. So like if you want to make a tote bag out of thicker leather, you would definitely want to hammer the seams open like that. So that's a brief description and a brief tutorial about leather. Do you have questions? It's fun to sew with. I actually feel, because I've sewn with both, vinyl is nice. Vinyl is fun because a lot of people don't want leather. They want to use something like pleather. Vinyl and pleather are very different. PVC is something that would be vinyl, but pleather can be a knitted fabric and then something, the substance poured on it and to look like leather. That stuff is more like fabric than vinyl, and it's easier to sew. Vinyl itself is kind of hard to sew. It's just not as forgiving. Leather is very forgiving, very malleable, and vinyl is stiff. Not stiff to sew, but it just doesn't, it's not as forgiving and malleable as leather is. Not to say you shouldn't use vinyl. I use vinyl for a lot of things. It's fun, but it just has different handling. All this stuff has different handling. That's what you learn. Every time I buy a new textile, it's a little bit different. I have to address it. Sometimes I know how to address it. Other times I have to experiment with it just like you would. So, don't be afraid to take samples first and play with it a little bit. I always wash my fabric before I use it, just because I want to know if it's going to shrink. I want it to do the shrinking. It may not shrink 100% the way it's going to always shrink, but if there is some shrinkage, it will start on the first wash. And I wash it and dry it the same way I would want to care for the fabric in the future. So if I'm always going to wash it in cold water, I still wash it in cold water and I throw it in the dryer. If I want to use hot water, then I use it right away. And then I take it out. And sometimes it needs ironing before I have to get to use it. And other times it does not. But the one thing you may want to address is the end cuts. If you're going to wash your fabric, the end cuts could be not raveling at the moment, but in the washer, they're going to ravel really badly. So you would overlock those edges that were cut at the fabric store, or you could zigzag over them just to stop the raveling and then get that out of the way so that you don't have a shock when you get into the washer like I did yesterday. This fabric, I finished the edges, but there was, I guess there was some snagging that happened, and it happened with all the red threads throughout the whole piece. So it kind of got ruined, but it was free fabric. We don't care what happens to free fabric. It's an experiment. So I'll let you get back to work. Any questions on leather? Once you get a little piece of leather, you can make one of those little zipper pouches. They're great in leather. I like them. I'll drink my coffee while you guys work. Stopping the recording.